Welcome to Season 2 of Fusion Fiction. I am your host, Madhulika Ra Chauhan. In Fusion Fiction, the world we create together has no limits. Stories written and narrated by me await you, where the magic of narrative will carry you away, episode by episode. So close your eyes and let your ears be the canvas. In a world torn apart by violence and prejudice, a young woman must confront her deepest fears and prejudices, where she is forced to seek refuge in a Muslim household. As riots rage outside, her internal battle becomes just as dangerous as the chaos on the streets. Will empathy be enough to bridge the divide? Or will the hatred she's been taught destroy her? Let's find out. In today's episode of Fusion Fiction, the second in the series, Salaam. The rays of the sun, caught in between the broken hinges of the window, made their way inside the room. A sharp sting on my forehead jolted me awake, and I blinked against the soft light filtering through the cracks in the window. My hand instinctively reached up to my head, fingers bruising the thick bandage wrapped around it. The room spun briefly before I focused. Dream? No, too real for that. My chest tightened as the weight of the moment settled in. Last thing I remembered was a shot of pain in my head. I looked upon the ceiling. This was not my room. I looked around, my head still dizzy with the impact. It was a small room with chairs stacked up in one corner. The room had a look of a careless abandonment. The stale smell of dampness lingered about in the room. Dust particles danced in the thin beam of the sun, making its way through the hinges of the wooden window behind me. Perhaps the room was not used very often. A thin and even sheet of dust had evenly formed on the floor, and on them were clearly visible footprints, probably the same size as mine. Someone had visited me. How I ended up there, I did not know. I pushed open the window on the wall behind the bed I was sitting on. It opened up to the courtyard of a house buzzing with activity. I craned my neck to look below. The room must have been on the second floor. I saw children playing, women moving around, water overflowing from the metal bucket kept under the tap. The walls were all painted white, with the wooden doors painted in a deep sap green. Strange color for a door. The house had high walls like a fortress, so nothing from outside was visible from inside. Just the roofs of adjacent houses with ugly mesh of wires and antennas to catch the signal from the satellite. My gaze was broken by the knock on the door. Kaun hai? I asked instinctively. It's me. Uh, Ammu? A feminine voice answered from the back of the door. The door opened of Fusion Fiction. The rays of the sun, caught in between the broken hinges of the window, made their way inside the room. A sharp sting on my forehead jolted me awake, and I blinked against the soft light filtering through the cracks in the window. My hand instinctively reached up to my head, fingers bruising the thick bandage wrapped around it. The room spun briefly before I focused. Dream? No, too real for that. My chest tightened as the weight of the moment settled in. Last thing I remembered was a shot of pain in my head. I looked upon the ceiling. This was not my room. I looked around, my head still dizzy with the impact. It was a small room with chairs stacked up in one corner. The room had a look of a careless abandonment. The stale smell of dampness lingered about in the room. Dust particles danced in the thin beam of the sun, making its way through the hinges of the wooden window behind me. Perhaps the room was not used very often. A thin and even sheet of dust had evenly formed on the floor, and on them were clearly visible footprints, probably the same size as mine. Someone had visited me. How I ended up there, I did not know. I pushed open the window on the wall behind the bed I was sitting on. It opened up to the courtyard of a house buzzing with activity. I craned my neck to look below. The room must have been on the second floor. I saw children playing, women moving around, water overflowing from the metal bucket kept under the tap. The walls were all painted white, with the wooden doors painted in a deep sap green. Strange color for a door. The house had high walls like a fortress, so nothing from outside was visible from inside. Just the roofs of adjacent houses with ugly mesh of wires and antennas to catch the signal from the satellite. My gaze was broken by the knock on the door. Kaun hai? I asked instinctively. It's me, uh, Ammu. A feminine voice answered from the back of the door. The door opened and Ammu left herself in. The door opened and Ammu let herself in. She was dressed in a simple white salwar kameez with a scarf covering her head. She had wide black eyes lined with kohl to accentuate their beauty. I looked at Ammu. Assalamu alaikum, she greeted. The words Assalamu alaikum hung in the air. Unfamiliar yet oddly comforting. It took me a moment to register her greeting. The realization stuck. I was in a Muslim household. The silence that followed felt thick, as if her greeting had created a boundary I wasn't sure how to cross. My mouth went dry. What was I supposed to say? The words that I had always known felt distant now, foreign somehow. Muslims, Muslims. All my life I had one Muslim classmate. She ate meat. I could never imagine the very idea of killing an animal and consuming it. The idea of seeing an animal as food was demonic to me. You become what you eat, my father used to say as he narrated stories of demons and goddesses during our lunch together. Demons eat meat and kill animals for pleasure, he would say. In each of these stories, the demons were the epitome of all that could be associated with not being human. My mother always kept separate cups for the Muslim Union members who came to meet my father. Helping her in the kitchen with tea, I would quietly notice her pouring tea in the cup lying abandoned at the back of the crockery cupboard. She would place them strategically at one corner of the tray, slightly away from the rest, so that it could help her detect which cups to give to the Muslim members. They are meat eaters, Asmi. If we drink in the same utensil, we would disrespect our religion, she had explained to me. Water? Ammu held a metal tumbler filled with water and gave it to me. She told me I had been unconscious for 2 days now. My limbs felt weak for the lack of energy. The cool metal of the tumbler pressed against my palm. Its weight, a stark reminder of my discomfort. The thought of drinking from it churned my stomach, but the parched dryness in my throat overpowered my hesitation. How could I drink it here from their hands? I had never shared food. I had never shared food with anyone outside my circle. And here I was, drinking water offered by someone who was everything I had been taught to fear. A wave of guilt flooded me, cold and nauseating. I was betraying something deep inside me that told me I shouldn't be here. Yet, despite the years of teaching, something in me softened. Maybe it was the kindness in Ammu's eyes, or the way her hands had gently placed the tumbler in mine, offering it without judgment, without hesitation. I was too thirsty to refuse. My mind flashed to my father's stern face, his sharp words cutting through my guilt. Selfish, weak, you have dishonored your own blood. He would say that I'd let my hunger, my thirst become more important than who I was supposed to be. I swallowed, pushing the thought away, but the weight of it clung to me, heavier than the water in my stomach. Shiva Shiva, Shiva Shiva, I said, touching my ears to seek pardon and to do away with the wrath I had called upon myself by drinking it. How did I get here? Abu brought you home. You were caught in the riots. No one knew who you were. You had fainted on the road. The scene of horror came back to me. A man was running towards me, his face ridden with fear. Fear of sure death, which followed him as a mob of at least 50 men holding broken glass bottles, bamboo sticks, and metal rods were behind him. They looked angry, their faces twisted with fury and determination to kill the man running in front. They were shouting. They were shouting, Allahu Akbar, which to me sounded like a war cry. I had very little time to think and act. They had barely meters away from where I stood. I looked around for a place to hide. I caught sight of a deserted peddler's cart, and I ran to hide under it. My heart raced as I saw the mob approach behind the man. My body was cold with shock and fear. The mob was closing in on him. Metallic sound of iron shutters being pulled down filled my ears. The shop owners on the street started to close the shutters of their shops. The deafening sound of the blast threw a few men off their places, flying in the air before they fell on the ground. I pulled my legs up and put my hands around them. Pieces of metal and small pebbles spread around. They set a fire to a parked car, which went off with an ear-deafening bang. The air became dense with black clouds of smoke rising from the car and smell of petrol. The men were barely inches behind the man. They started to throw stones at him. Finally, someone caught on to the man and pulled him down on the road by the back of his collar. The mob got the better of him. They caught him by his hands and dragged him with his back on the road. It was right in front of my eyes. He was beaten with the bamboo sticks, sharp glass pieces, and stones. I covered my mouth with my hand to stop myself from screaming aloud. Blood splashed on the ground, on the tiny pebbles around on the road. They hit him mercilessly. With his hands folded, he made his bid for mercy. They were beyond reproach, beyond any human feeling at all. With blood in their eyes, they just wanted to do one thing: kill him. I was quietly chanting my mantras under my breath. Someone crashed a glass bottle on his head. Pieces of shredded glass flew around. Some more people had joined the crowd, and there were more fights starting with the men who had just entered the mob. It was no longer all men against one. The fight spread. It became bigger and out of control. I was still hiding under the cart. Someone in the mob had spotted my blue dupatta. Of control. I was still hiding under the cart. Someone in the mob had spotted my blue dupatta. A few men rushed towards the cart I was hiding under and bent to see me. One of them shouted towards the others to direct their attention to me. A girl caught in the midst of a riot. He caught hold of my foot and tried to pull me out. I was holding on tightly to the metal axle of the cart. He pulled me hard. My strength was no match to the man pulling me. He pulled me out, holding both my legs. During the tug, my head struck the ground and my elbows got bruised against the cemented road. I had mud in my mouth, mixed with the taste of blood. Bachao! My throat constricted as I let out a scream. It was weak, barely a whisper, swallowed by the roar of the mob outside. I could feel their eyes on me, the sharp pull of their hands as they dragged me through the dust. I wanted to fight back, but my body felt like it belonged to someone else, heavy, unresponsive. The sound of the mob was deafening, their anger a physical force that crushed me beneath it. Nobody was paying attention to the girl trapped in the unrest. A man who had pulled me out from under the cart held me by the arm and pulled me up, straight. I held myself down. Tears blinded me. I was crying and pleading at the same time. My existence meant nothing to the man who held me. Someone from behind the man saw me. He rushed towards us and hit me on the head. The impact was sudden. I fell on the ground, unconscious. My memory drew a blank after that. What happened to the man they were chasing? What man? They all were chasing a man. They were going to kill him. Those Muslims, they were going to kill him. I realized the words came out of my mouth a little too late. I gazed at Ammu's face. It was forlorn. Riots broke out in the city. Many people were killed. Curfew has been imposed in major parts of the city. The situation is still tense. She added in a low voice. I want to go home. I cannot stay here. I have to go. I thought of my mother. She would be worried sick not knowing where I was. I wished I could somehow run from here and hide in her comforting embrace. Array, are you crazy? I just told you that the city is in a bad shape. Many people lost their lives. Ammu raised her voice for the first time. You can leave once the curfew is lifted. She added after a pause. Ammu, asr ka waqt ho gaya hai. A woman's voice came up for Ammu from below the open window. I did not understand what it meant, but Ammu got into action immediately. She unrolled a chatai kept folded in the corners of the room, on the floor in front of me, and wrapped the scarf around her face, covering her forehead, head and shoulders. She tied the scarf in a way that only parts visible were her eyes to her chin. She sat on her knees, brought her hands together to form a fold with the palm facing her face. With her eyes closed, she kept reciting what looked like a small prayer to me. She moved her head from one side to another and then bowed her head on the ground and kissed it. Ammu looked serene while her head moved across in adulation to Allah. She repeated the process several times before she got up, untied her scarf, and folded the chatai and left the room. I watched her kneel, her hands folding with such grace, the scarf around her head pulling tight as she bowed. Every moment seemed fluid, peaceful. She recited quietly, the words flowing from her lips like a prayer I couldn't quite understand, but somehow I felt the rhythm of it deep in my chest. I had never seen anyone pray this way, so close and so intimate. My mind began to wander, drawing parallels between her ritual and my own. I closed my eyes and thought of the small shrine back home. How different are we really? My thoughts drifted to my mandir at home, my small Krishna statue sitting lonely, gathering dust. I used to bring him offerings every day, fruits, flowers, sweets. I thought of the quiet moment when I light the incense, the room filling with its calming fragrance. Would he be there alone, waiting for me to come back? For a moment, the thought of my idol, my quiet companion, felt more distant than I had ever known him. But Ammu, she prays with such devotion. Does God care what form the prayer takes? Perhaps I felt more alone not being able to pray with him in front. I turned around to face the sun and closed my eyes, to say my prayers silently as silent tears wet my face. Why me? I asked. I lay in the room all day sitting around the barred window, looking down on the open area within the house. The bars had rusted with time. giving them a reddish brown hue. The scraps of rust fell as I held the bars sometimes. The women of the house were usually busy, doing household chores just like my mother. This was a family of four brothers living together with their wives and children. The house was always buzzing with activity. I sat near the window, sometimes crying, other times smiling at the small fights and the kids had in the enclosed space. Evenings were usually tense when the men in the house came from outside, the air uptight with the talks of tension prevailing in the city. As the days passed, the tension in the city kept mounting. Even the air had become heavy with the smell of smoke and blood. Every day, the count of dead seemed to go up. The unrest did not end for the coming days either. I mostly stayed in my room. I had somehow made it a part of my stay there to just be in my room. I would get my meals in the room, which I ate with utmost disgust, just enough to keep me alive. I prayed profusely and intently after each meal so as to wash off the sins I had committed. I took another bite, but it tasted wrong, like I wasn't meant for me. The rice was warm, soft, and nourishing. Yet, with each mouthful, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I could feel their eyes on me sometimes, the way they watched me, expecting me to eat, to share their meal. But I couldn't escape the heavy feeling that wasn't supposed to be here, in their house, eating their food. Would my father ever forgive me for this? I pushed this thought aside, but it lingered like the taste of the food, something I couldn't quite shake. The only time I left my room was to keep the unclean utensils after eating. I had to cross a fleet of narrowly built staircase. Only one person could pass through them at one time. I carried my unclean dishes, stepping carefully at night to avoid a fall. Once, while passing through the open area of the house, I overheard a conversation between one of the son and his wife. She was serving him hot chapati she had just brought over from the kitchen. Kitne mare? She asked him in a hushed tone. The official figure is 20, but we don't know. It's a lot more, he answered gravely, referring to the count of the dead for that day. Kafir? She asked, referring to the non-Muslims. The man motioned in refusal, confirming her fears. Ya Allah, Rahem, she sighed. The woman's eyes fell on me. I lowered my eyes to avoid any contact with hers. I could feel the hatred and the apathy they felt towards me, perhaps the same as I felt for them. We had shared the core of hatred for generations, fighting for our identity on the name of religion, creating disparity and fissures with our prejudices against each other, condemning each other's beliefs and choice of food. The feeling was mutual. I washed my plate in silence and left for my room. It must have been the middle of the night when someone broke open into my room. Still groggy from my sleep, I sat up on the wooden cot, awakened by the sound of the wooden door. No one ever entered like this before. I could hear a man breathing. He was moving closer. Stepping carefully, I held the sides of the cot, trying to find something to hit back. Something metallic shone in the hands in the bright light of the moon. He was carrying some sharp object. I screamed. He came nearer and put his hand on my mouth. He was Ahmed. He was Ahmed, the youngest son in the family. His silhouette was clear in the bright light of the moon making its way through the window. The metal tumbler kept on the small stool beside my bed fell on the ground and made a loud, clinking sound. He stared at me with his bloodshot eyes. Little beads of sweat shone on his forehead as he came nearer. Ahmed was too angry to bother about the sound. I heard hasty steps on the staircase coming towards my room. I felt a little relief despite the situation. Amu had probably heard the commotion caused by my voice and the tumbler. Her room was closest to mine. She, s- she switched on the light in the room and saw Ahmed standing near me, holding my mouth by one hand. His other hand was holding a long, sharp knife held in a position to strike. He looked up as Amu entered. Leave her, Amu shouted. Get back, I warn you, Amu. Her people are killing ours every day, and we are hiding her safely in our house. They show us no mercy. Let me kill her. No, shrieked Amu. We are no one to take anyone's life. Stop behaving like an animal. Abu got her home half dead. She is in our panah. Be afraid of Allah. He sees everything. Don't be mad, she pleaded. Amu had walked up to Ahmed and held him by his arm, pulling him back. We have been staying here in this country. This is our home. Still, we are considered outsiders, all because of these bloody Hindus. Let me finish her. Amu stood between him and me, facing Ahmed. Ahmed reached out to me. I covered myself with both arms and hands and pulled the sheets up to save me. I reached out for Amu's dupatta, tears trickling down my cheeks. Fear was written all over my face. Fear of death, which was not only a few feet away from me. Go back to your room, Ahmed. More footsteps followed on the staircase. Other members of the family had probably heard the mayhem. Ahmed's father, Junaid Sahab, entered the room. He looked straight into Ahmed's eyes. Ahmed looked down. It was a silent moment for the family. Amu loosened her grip on Ahmed. She knew all would be fine now her father was there. Everyone returned to their rooms except Amu. Junaid Saab asked Amu to sleep with me for the rest of the night. I held on to Amu closely and wept for the entire night. I shed a lot of tears that night for my saved life, for the fear I felt, and above all, for the hatred I had in me for them. Amu held my hand like my mother would have. Her body shook as she sobbed with me. Her arms held my head tightly while she stroked my back. She was my anchor. Shedding those tears together for and with each other, for the apathy for life and death we had faced together for centuries, made us one. As I lay there, Amu's warmth beside me, something inside me began to shift. The world outside seemed so vast, filled with division, Hindus, Muslims, rioters, victims. But in that moment, it felt smaller, more connected. We are the same, aren't we? Just different vessels, but the same souls. Amu's presence beside me, her hand holding mine as if I were her own blood. It wasn't just comforting, it was a revelation. In her eyes, I saw not just kindness, but a deep, quiet strength. We were not so different. We were, after all, made by the same God. That night, the boundaries of religion, food ceased to exist, at least for us. We were the children of the same God, in essence. Next morning, everyone went about doing their work like nothing had happened the night before. There were the usual bustle in the kitchen where morning tea. Next morning, everyone went about doing their work like nothing had happened the night before. There was the usual bustle in the kitchen where morning tea was brewing. I came out of the room facing the morning sun, breathing in the fresh air. It made me feel alive. I came down from my room, taking the stairs. Junaid Saab was sitting on a chair in the open area of the house, listening to the morning news on the radio set intently. His tea rested on the side of the chair. He was listening to the news in the radio as the announcer talked about the tense situation prevailing in the city. I came near him. He did not see me or notice me. He held his ears close to the radio set. listening in intently. I bent down to touch his feet. He got up, alarmed at my touch. I looked up to face him and waved my hand, touching my forehead in salutation, and said, Salaam. He smiled back at me. Walaikum assalam, he responded, nodding his head. It was a greeting from one human to another. Thank you for joining us on Fusion Fiction. If this story has made you think, share your thoughts with me. Reach out to me on social media or write to me at madhulikarachauhan@gmail.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Fusion Fiction to hear more stories that make us question the world around us. Have fun until we meet next. This is Madhulika Ra Chauhan, and you are listening to Fusion Fiction. Have a blessed day ahead.